Hello, I'm Andy Pogue from the Spencer Hill Church of Christ. Thank you for joining me. I want to talk about Paul's thorn in the flesh and see if we can maybe get some applications for today that might be helpful for us. You can read about that in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, that Paul had this thorn in the flesh. So here are my questions for you. Can God use weaknesses, persecutions, hard times, things that are going on to accomplish His will? I think He can, and we'll talk about that. But specifically, can God use you with whatever adversities you may be going through, whatever hard times, whatever weaknesses that may be yours? Can God use you to do great things for Him? Maybe you think, well, if I weren't so quiet, if I had this skill, if I could be a little more outgoing, then I could do great things for Christ. And on the opposite hand, there may be those who say, you know what, if I weren't so outgoing, if I could just rein it in a little bit, maybe I'd be useful for Christ. And so maybe we're saying, you know what, if we weren't in the times that we're in, if things were not where they are, if the circumstances were not this, I could do great things. And I think God is telling us, maybe through this present crisis, that it's time to quit focusing on business as usual and to focus on His will for us and His guidance for us. It's not all about the stuff that we have, and we realize that now. You know what? This present disease has hit folks, rich, poor, old, young, in between. And God may be calling us to say, you know what, let's focus about the things that are important. Well, 2 Corinthians chapter 12, I want to skip down to verse 12. And after Paul had in the first part of that chapter, talked about some great revelations that had been his as an apostle, as a chosen vessel by Christ to accomplish great things. He had been privileged to see into the very throne room of Christ. And he talks about that in the third person in a very humble way. It's obvious that he's talking about himself. But then down in verse 7, he said, "And lest I should be exalted above measure by the abundance of the revelations, a thorn in the flesh was given to me, a messenger of Satan to buffet me, lest I should be exalted above measure." And that goes on down to verse 10. And so for a couple of chapters, Paul has been defining himself and his ministry and defending it. They were saying, Paul, you're a weak person. Oh, you write some really great letters, and you're very strong in your letters, but in person, your presence is very weak. They even accused him of being worldly and doing the things that he did simply for gain. And then they came with this charge, you know what, you're just kind of second class. You're not that impressive. You're not a great speaker or whatever the problem was. They just sort of said, Paul, you know what, you're second class. And in response, Paul says, well, I'm going to boast a little bit. I'm going to brag on myself. I'm going to defend myself. But he says I'm going to do that by highlighting my weaknesses. And I think there's something that we can get out of there. You know, you ever find yourself boasting about something, or someone is bragging on you, and you kind of get puffed up with that, and maybe out of the corner of your eye, you catch your spouse or you catch your kids, and they're looking at you like, we know you better than that, and it really kind of brings you down to where you ought to be, doesn't it? Well, you know what? Even if you can boast, it's useless, because maybe you could fool some folks. Maybe you could fool a lot of folks, but you can't fool God. Psalm 139, 1 and 2 says, "O Lord, you have searched me and known me. You know my sitting down and my rising up." But notice the next phrase. He said, "You understand my thoughts afar off." And we know that God knows what we're thinking. He knows what we're about. And so it really doesn't matter what someone else may say about us. What matters is what God thinks about us. And so back to 2 Corinthians 12, Paul says there in verse 6, I might desire to boast, but I'll not be a fool. I'll speak the truth, but I'll refrain, lest anyone should think above what he sees in me or hears from me. All right? So Paul's detractors, his enemies, were boasting in a couple of things about themselves. They talked about their Jewish heritage and how they relied on that. And that was supposed to make them super Christians because they had been good Jews and their heritage and their background was impeccable. And then they bragged about all that they had done for the Lord. Those were the two things that they bragged about themselves. And Paul addresses their points. I mean, as far as heritage goes, he calls himself, a Hebrew of the Hebrews. He is the top dog when it comes to Judaism, but he turned that aside. And then he talks about his about the things that he had done for Christ and all the suffering that he had gone through and all the things that he had accomplished. But those are not what he's going to boast in. He's going to boast in his weakness. Now how could he do that? How can someone boast about their weaknesses? I mean, weaknesses are something that we try to hide, we try to cover up. But have you ever thought that maybe it is those weaknesses, maybe it is those limitations, handicaps, however you want to address that. Maybe it is the hard times that you're going through or have been through that actually help you be useful in your service to Christ. We want to cover those things up. Oh, I don't do this very well, or I don't do that, or I don't have this, and we hide those things from others. And we don't know, we don't want to draw attention to that. But it's actually the person who is weak who can be useful to Christ. Think about this. You go down the road and you see a big, huge mansion and nice cars out front and maybe people working in the yard. And have you ever stopped to think, what, I need to stop and see if they need a meal. I need to see if they stop and need to see if they need this or that. Well, no, you don't do that because they're powerful. And yet it's the weak person that we recognize their need, the person on the side of the road, the person that we hear about who's in dire straits. And so, we want to help them. Well, Christ can use weak people to do great things. And Paul says, what? I could have gotten so big for my britches. I could have gotten such a big head with all these things that I had, with all the things that I had been allowed to see. And so I needed this to bring me down. Now, again, we may run into somebody and we think, man, they've got it all together. Their Christianity, they never struggle with anything. They're just clicking on all cylinders, and they've got the education, and they've got the background, and they've got the ability, and they've got the willingness, and all of those things. And what do you think? I couldn't do that. I couldn't do that in a million years. But then we see someone who maybe struggles and they've been through a lot, but they've overcome that and they're able to say, what, it is the power of Christ that allows me to do that. And what do we think? Well, if they can do it, I can do it, right? And so there are weaknesses that actually can be a benefit for that. Well, now, Paul's thorn in the flesh, what was it? Well, your guess is as good as mine. We know that it was regular and intense, and he prayed 3 times about it. What was the answer? Well, the answer to Paul was much like the answer to Christ in the garden when 3 times Jesus prays, Father, if there's another way, take this away. Take this away. I don't want to go through this. It's going to be painful. It's going to be difficult. It's going to be all of these things. And if there's another way, can we do it another way? And yet God answers, no, it's got to be done that way. Paul prays 3 times. Take this away. Can you take this away? And I'm sure in Paul's defense, he's thinking, if I could get this out of the way, how much more effective I could be in working for Christ. I mean, yeah, I've been able to do this and this, but man, if I just had that out of the way, what could I accomplish? What's the answer he's given? My grace is sufficient. My grace is sufficient. You know what? I'll take care of you. It'll be okay. God says to Paul, you need this in order to be useful to me. It actually helps. And so then Paul realizes the value of the very thing that he wants taken away. And so in 2 Corinthians 12, verse 9, he says, therefore, most gladly, I rather boast in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. I take pleasure in my infirmities, in reproaches, in needs, in persecutions, in distresses, for Christ's sake. But here's what he says, for when I am weak, then I am strong. When I'm weak, then I'm strong. Are you as helped by that as I am? I mean, does that give you hope? That God can take what Satan had intended to slow Paul down and to make it difficult, if not impossible, for him to do his work. He took those very things that Satan intended for evil, and he changed those to the very thing that Paul could use, right? He could do that because Paul needed to turn to Christ in childlike dependence and say, I can't do this on my own. I need to turn to Christ and say, I can't do this on my own. It's not my power. The power of the preaching of God's word is not in the messenger. I think we talked about adorning the doctrine of Christ in a video. We need to do our very best to present it in the very best light. But the power is in the gospel of Christ. I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Christ. It's the power of God to salvation. And so the message is the power. And when we tell people that there is a God, that he had a son, Jesus, that he came from heaven to live on earth and experience what you and I go through, that they rejected him and they killed him in a very cruel way, and he submitted to that he was buried, he rose the third day, he went back to heaven, that he left his will for us in the scripture, and that we'll know how to one day be with him when we leave this earth. And that his blood can cleanse us from the sin that separates us from God. That's the power. The death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. That's the gospel. That's the good news. And that's where the power is. It's not in how I may say it or someone else may say it or turn a great phrase. Maybe those things are appealing to us in some ways, but the power is in the message, not in the messenger. And so we have these weaknesses, these hardships, these things that we deal with from time to time. I want to quote a man named John Berridge, who wrote in the 18th century, and I think that this will help us to understand how much more useful we could be in times of difficulty and adversity and all of those things. And here's what he said: a Christian never falls asleep in fire or water, but he grows weary in the sunshine. Listen again. A Christian never falls asleep in fire or water, but he grows dreary in sunshine. You know, when you're going through the fire, you're very aware of your circumstances. When you feel like you're drowning, you're very aware of the circumstances. But when everything's going well and it's sunny and beautiful and everything seems to be going our way, we can let our guard down, can't we? And so we see that sometimes it may not be the physical or the mental or the ability handicaps that we have. It may be the circumstances that we're going through that are really meant to sharpen us and to focus us on what we ought to be doing. And so maybe your limitations and difficulties and experiences and all of those things are the very things that you need in order to do what you need to be doing. Maybe the disappointments that have come your way and the hardships and the losses and all of those things can be used for Christ if we're just willing to do that and to depend on him. Well, I hope we're back together again soon and we're able to say these things face to face. But until then, I pray for you, and I hope you'll pray for me. And I hope that this is over soon and we're back together. I look forward to that time. Thank you for listening.